Welcome to the Lawyerist Podcast, a series of conversations about law practice. Each week, we talk with legal entrepreneurs and innovators about building a successful law practice in today's challenging and constantly changing legal market. And now, here are your hosts.
Hi, I'm Sam Glover.
And I'm Aaron Street, and this is episode 200 of the Lawyerist Podcast. Holy shit.
I can't believe we've been doing this for almost 4 years.
This show is part of the Legal Talk Network, and today we're talking with George Psiharis about the state of solo and small law firm practice.
Today's podcast is brought to you by LawPay, Smokeball, New Law Business Model, and Ruby Receptionist. We wouldn't be able to do the show without their support, so stay tuned and we'll tell you more about them later.
How in the world have we done this for 200 episodes?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing because we started it like, hey, maybe we should try podcasting.
Yeah, and now it's 4 years later.
Yeah, no, it's
That's
been awesome.
nuts. To celebrate our 200th episode, Lindsay is putting together a video celebrating some of our favorite episodes of the past 4 years and a post with our team's favorite episodes of the past 4 years. And so there's some best of highlights you can check out on Lawyerist right now.
Yeah, go find those on the front page of Lawyerist. And you know what? Thanks for listening for this whole time or part of the time or however much you've been listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten a lot out of it. And I hope you share it with people you think might also be interested.
If you've actually listened to all 200 episodes, you should send us an email.
Yeah.
And we'll give you a thing.
How do they verify that?
I don't know.
We should have like a 5-question quiz.
Yeah, we'll quiz you on the obscure stuff.
In which episodes did we swear?
Well, it's like 163 of them.
I want the total. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've listened to all 200 episodes, wow. Sorry for the first 10 or 20.
Yeah.
And thank you. And let us know because we want to know who the podcast super fans are.
For anyone who's listening, whatever, if there's something that you would like to hear, let us know about it.
In the next 200 episodes?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like everything changes at 201. We are doing what we're doing. We're trying to have interesting conversations with lawyers and business leaders about how to run better practices. And that's what we're going to keep on doing. But if there's something in particular you'd like to hear, please let us know. We'd like to hear about it.
Yes. Thank you for allowing us to make it this far.
Thanks very much. For today's episode, we've got a brief sponsored conversation with Diana Stapleton from Ruby Receptionist, and then we'll talk about the state of small law with George Psiharis.
Hi, I'm Diana Stapleton with Ruby Receptionist. We're a live virtual receptionist service here in Portland, Oregon.
Hi, Diana. It's good to hear from you again.
Thanks, you too.
So you, by you, I mean Ruby, just put out a new guide to call handling. And so you identified 5 keys to great call handling. And I guess what we mean by that is answering the phone, right? How can you do a great job of bringing in those calls and then helping the person on the end of the line? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that is exactly what we mean.
Cool. So it's the hello law office, but better.
A little bit.
Hopefully better. So number 1 is greet graciously. What do you mean by that? I assume that means not hello law office.
Correct. And it's not just the words you use, but it's really the tone you use. Often when you're deep in thought and you're working on a brief or you're doing whatever it is you're doing and the phone rings, it's really an interruption. And if you answer it quickly without taking that deep breath of thinking, this could be my next big client, or this could be my new best friend, or whoever you're thinking might be calling. If you take that deep breath and you answer with this feeling of like, oh, I'm glad I'm getting this call, but you really set the tone of the call with a clear, warm introduction that lets them know that you're glad they called, that you tell them where they're calling. So yes, law office to some degree defines that, but not as well as actually saying the name of your firm. And then offering to help, good morning, you've reached ABC Law Office. How may I help you today? Kind of thing.
So second is mind your manners. What does that mean?
That's really a matter of, again, kind of word choice. So, there's a big difference of saying, who are you versus may I have your name, please? There's even And this is a little bit of a stray from manners, but it's along the same vein of just always, if someone asks you a question rather than, if they ask you if you can do something, rather than saying, sure, you could say, I'd be delighted to, it really creates a different conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Avoiding dead ends. How do you keep that from happening? happening?
Yeah, so that's something. It's one of my personal pet peeves. It happened to me a couple days ago. I called a business. I asked a question, and the woman said, "I don't know,"
And that was it. Yeah,
and that was it. Dead air. And I took a deep breath and I said, "Well, gosh, is there anyone who, we might be able to ask? Is there anyone else I could talk to?" But so the idea of avoiding dead ends is if invariably someone is going to ask you a question you don't know the answer to. Mm-hmm. But there's a big difference between saying, "I don't know," and leaving it there, or saying, "Oh, let me find out for you." Mm-hmm. Or the attorney would be the best person to answer that. Let me see if she's available. Anything like that, just not to dead end the person. Really, I can't think of another phrase for it.
It sounds like the sort of the conversational equivalent of when you give somebody a list of days and times that you could meet for lunch, and they just respond with, "I'm not available at any of those times."
Right. Great. What am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah. How about when you are?
Yeah.
Next is deflect with style. What does that mean?
So that's a similar idea of avoiding dead ends. So it's if you aren't the person who can help the caller, then try to send them off in the direction of someone who can. So, saying that the attorney should be available soon and we'll get back to you kind of thing. Mm-hmm. To graciously do it, though, and again, to avoid the, "I'm just the receptionist.
Sure.
Can't help you."
You want to position yourself as someone who can help and is eager to help and will do it as soon as they're available and it's possible.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
And finally, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah. So that's really about the idea that, we all make mistakes, right? And sometimes on a call, you won't have done exactly what you wanted to do or said exactly what you wanted to say, and it just didn't go the way you wanted it to. That's okay. So most things can be smoothed over with some friendliness and a sincere desire to help. So just be a real human being and try to connect with the caller in that way. And people are usually going to be okay with it. An apology goes a long way, and just being a real human goes a long way.
I think it also helps to over communicate, doesn't it? Like to say what it is that is awkward and how it makes you feel and that you can fix it or offering to fix it or whatever.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And it's interesting. This is not a call handling example, but it's been a running thing with my friends and me that I am an iced tea drinker. And when I order my iced tea, I generally ask if I can have some sweetener with it. Mm-hmm. And generally, more often than not, the waiter or waitress comes back with my iced tea and no sweetener. Mm-hmm. And so when they bring it, I say, "Oh gosh, could I trouble you for some sweetener?" And they say, "Sure." And they go off, and then they don't come back with it. And the next time I see them, I ask again. And the thing is, there's a huge difference in the way I perceive it when the person says, "Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm so sorry."
Yeah.
And, I forgot. And they don't even have to be sorry. They're just that recognition of, "Oh gosh, you've asked me for this twice already." Then all is forgiven from my mind. Right. I don't care that it took 3 askings to get it. I just want
kind of want them to feel a little bit bad.
Right. Well, I really just want to be recognized that I'm not losing my mind. Like I have continually asked you for this, and at some point I'd love you to bring it to me, So
listeners, if you'd like to learn more and if you'd like to apply these strategies to your own call handling, you will be able to find this at callruby.com/lawyeristpod. That's callruby.com/lawyeristpod. And we'll obviously include that link in the show notes so you can click on it. Diana, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
My name is George Psiharis, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Clio.
Hey, George. Thanks for being with us again today.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I should offer a little bit of a disclaimer here up front because it's unusual for us to have you on the podcast because Clio is and has been for a very long time an advertiser and supporter of Lawyerist. And so we don't usually invite advertisers to be on the core podcast, but Clio has done something really unique and I think uniquely valuable in the Legal Trends Report. And so I think it's important that you know that there's this potential conflict there, but I really, really want to talk to you about the Legal Trends Report. So this is what, year 3, George?
Yes, that's right. This is our 3rd year publishing the report.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the report came about, since we haven't had a chance to talk much about it before.
Absolutely. We took a look around at the legal profession and realized that there wasn't really a great source of truth or a benchmark study that answered a lot of simple, basic questions. And how these basic questions came to our attention was actually through our support team at Clio. Mm-hmm. So they're used to receiving a lot of questions about our software and things related to using it, but they started getting questions from folks who were asking completely different things, like, "Hey, how much should I charge?" Or what's an average rate for someone in my practice area who's just getting started in this location? Mm-hmm. And they started to pass those inquiries along, and it kind of pointed to this gap, as far as I could tell, in data sources that were available to law firms, especially in the solo and small firm section of the marketplace.
Right. I mean, up to this point, like most of what we knew about anything about the legal profession was in the ABA's sort of big picture data or its annual legal tech survey, which we've always felt like is kind of skewed in weird directions. And that's about it.
And how they're working and profitability. But the things they had in common were they were all self-reported information, which for the stats nerds out there, which I hope there are many, are prone to something called social desirability bias.
Right.
So they can be inaccurate because it's kind of like when someone asks you how much you make or how tall you are or how much you weigh. There's this weird and totally human thing that we do where we say the answer we think we should as opposed to what we probably know to be true.
Right.
Sometimes. And so things that impact surveys, what we realized was we were sitting on actual source data, right? We're one of the most commonly used tools, and that created this store of data of what people are actually doing with their clients, how they were billing. That, of course, is their property. And so if we were able to anonymize and aggregate it responsibly, we'd be in position to report overall high-level trends that might inform people to make better decisions.
So this data is Clio user data.
It is, that's right.
And I will say you have anonymized and aggregated this responsibly as in every way that I can see. So just in case anybody's antenna goes up at that, it's not a big deal. How does the typical Clio user or the aggregate Clio user differ, do you think, from the legal market as a whole? Like what kind of biases might there be in the data just from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, historically, we're certainly a product that has appealed most to solos and small firms. Over the last few years, we're seeing much more rapid adoption among mid-market firms. But I think definitely our data set would be unique in that it's got a lot of information on very small firms, which of course we know comprise the majority of the space. So it's kind of like a skew in the data set, but also kind of one of the black boxes in the legal industry, right? It's very difficult to know what's going on at scale in a lot of those small firms.
It immediately seems to me, though, like your user base is probably more tech savvy than average.
That could be the case as well. Yeah, obviously, we expect folks who are ahead of the curve on the technology side to be the ones who have been using cloud technologies the longest.
Yeah.
So that could be a part of it as well.
So that's at least worth keeping in mind when we say what the data says, right? That we're probably talking about slightly more tech savvy lawyers, and for what it's worth, solo and small firm lawyers, although, you break it up by firm size anyway, which we would want to know. So
exactly.
Cool. So after the first year, you kind of started including some other data sources too, to try and find out more about like survey data from consumers and stuff. So where does that other data come from?
Yeah, great question. So the source data that we talked about is pretty high level, pretty broad, and it tells you a lot of the what's going on in the space, but not a lot of the why. And so in subsequent years, we have accompanied the study with a couple of different surveys. So we do a survey of law firms and legal professionals that we run in the lead up to publishing the report, and typically target getting several thousand responses.
And those include non-Clio users, right?
They do, that's right. Yeah. So a mix of people using Clio, but also lots of folks who aren't using Clio and folks from larger firms as well. And then we've also added a consumer survey where we interview and survey a mix of folks who are part of the consuming public who have worked with a law firm and had a legal issue, but also those who haven't, and ask some questions in areas like, how do you look for a law firm and what are you looking for? And also, how did your experience go? What's your feedback on that for folks who have worked at the firm?
Now, I should say before we start digging into what the trends report actually says to us, you can get a copy of it at, I think it's clio.com/LTR.
That's right. Free and available to download for anybody.
Yep. And we'll include a link in the show notes. If you got here from the website, you've already seen that link if you want to follow along. You led off the report, and by you, I mean, aggregate Clio you. This is not just the work of one person, but the report leads off with how do law firms define success and set and measure goals? Why is that kind of the headline for the report this year?
That's a great question. I think it's one of the things that we observe as one of the idiosyncrasies of law. It's actually quite difficult for folks to sit down and set goals and to differentiate goals from personal ones to ones on behalf of their clients, but then also for ones on behalf of their business. And so we wanted to set the tone by saying, hey, look, the way to become data-driven and the reason to look at all this information in the first place is this old saying in management science, started by Lord Kelvin back in the day and reiterated by Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed, right? This whole act of setting goals and then comparing how you're doing against them is important because it helps you create change. And it's one of those things that is easy to lose sight of in the recurring challenge, especially in a small legal practice where you're wearing all the hats and doing all of the things. So, yeah, we wanted to lead with that and really get a sense of, hey, folks in legal, how do we set and measure goals?
And so what did you find about how law firms are defining success?
Yeah, I had a little fun with that, both in how we wrote it in the report, but also in how we kind of summarized it in our recent Clio Cloud conference. So basically, folks want to grow their business and cite kind of increasing revenue and boosting firm efficiency as a couple of their top goals. But then of the choices we presented, the things that would drive more revenue kind of come in at the bottom. So most folks said, I'd like to increase revenue. But then when we said, hey, do you want to increase your billables or take on more work?
You're like, no, not really.
Not really. I like to make more revenue, but I don't do any of the stuff that drives it, right? And so to me, that's kind of like, hey, what's going on there, right? That's not intuitive, and is another classic case of the why, like what,
Right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting to increase your firm revenue. That's, after all, what your business is all about. But at the same time, that's kind of, if that's what you're laser focused on, like, and you're not thinking about increasing the number of clients you serve or increasing the productivity of your billables, like, you're probably not going to get there.
Exactly, right. And the other thing that jumps out to me is it a case of people want to do better on the revenue side, but the thought of taking on more work is like, I can't do that, right? Are they feeling maxed out already? And is it maybe a case of time to be smarter versus time to just throw more work at the problem?
I guess if I put this in context of previous year's headlines, which was all about the 6 hours a day that lawyers are not getting paid for. So maybe in context, how in the world am I going to grow my client base when I'm already maxed out and I'm not even billing those 6 hours a day? Maybe that's what's going on there.
Exactly.
Along with success, you talked about setting and measuring goals, which, I mean, this is in the survey data, I assume, right? These are questions you asked to those 2,000 lawyers who are both Clio and non-Clio users.
That's right.
Okay. So this is survey data, not built-in user data. What did you find out there?
Something very interesting on setting and measuring more goals. We had this section where we asked folks, like, how satisfied are you with how you set and measure those goals and doing things around improving and getting better at that stuff. And we found roughly around a quarter of firms report being highly satisfied with setting goals, measuring them, and performing against them. So about 75% of folks say, like, I'm not that happy with what I'm doing, but only 43%. Does that seem weird to you?
Because, like, they're your goals.
Yeah. Yeah. It does, right? It just shows more like people are like, I don't even know, how to get started on this one, right? Like, I'm pretty clear on the substantive work of my practice, but I don't know. Am I setting the right goals? Like, there's definitely, the majority of folks in that category, but then only 43% saying, yeah, I do need to get better at data insights and reporting and setting up all the things that would drive improvement in those things. So very similar to the goal setting around increasing revenue, but kind of not looking at the things that would drive it as high objectives, prioritized objectives for the firm.
Some of this is validating for me because, we've been using our small firm scorecard for most of the last year. And so we've got a similar amount. We're in the same neighborhood on the number of responses that we've got. And here we're asking lawyers to rate themselves on a number of things. And we're finding the same things. Lawyers don't know how to measure success. They don't have a strategy. They're not setting goals. Those are some of the lowest self-scored things on the small firm scorecard. So for what it's worth, I think our own data is supporting your data on that.
That's great.
So when you look at this and you try to extrapolate it, what do you think that means for what lawyers need to be focused on?
Yeah, I think where it took our train of thought at Clio and our data study this year was around kind of looking in two areas. So ostensibly, if you're not hitting your goals, there are improvements to be made, and things like tools or even a mindset around being goal-oriented drive us in this direction of doing the data study in the first place, right? Like, create the benchmark, put in people's minds for whatever stat they're looking for, and they can start to position against it, right? How am I doing? Am I positioned where I want to be? Things like the utilization rate that we reported in the past. The rate we reported, which came in at around 30% this year, is just a number, right? Mm-hmm. If that's what people were aiming for and they landed where they wanted, no problem. But if they expected to be at, 60, 70, 80% utilization rate and landed at 30, then that's a problem, right? So it really is about deciding where you want to land and setting goals for yourself. And I think it's a step that's often vacant, as you've reported, and I think you guys have discovered in your scorecard as well, from the thought process, especially for folks who are responsible to manage their own practices on the small end of the scale.
My hunch is that it's not so much about I'm unhappy with my goal setting, it's that I'm probably not doing it.
Exactly.
I mean, if your goal is increasing revenue, that's super vague. Or if it's something like increasing firm revenue, that's a pretty vague goal.
Exactly.
And it's hard to build a strategy or a plan for achieving it. So
yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the previous headline, which was all of the time that lawyers aren't billing for, and really drilling down to what that means for lawyers' effective hourly rates. And maybe that's worth starting by talking about what realization, utilization, and collection rates are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the metrics that we've defined are kind of our take and our definitions. They can vary in the industry, but they're a pretty sensible starting point. So we described 3 what we call KPIs, or key performance indicators, in the report. The first we call utilization rate. So what that looks at is, out of the available billable hours in the day, how many of those hours are put toward billables in the first place? So tracked as time or activities.
An important disclaimer, this works if you're flat fee or not, right? This is time for which you're doing work that you're being paid.
Yeah, exactly. And so of the estimate we use is a total of 8 hours per day. So in our survey, we asked folks, like, what's your typical workday? By and large, the vast majority of respondents put in 8 hours. Mm-hmm. So we use 8 hours a day to create a statistical estimate, and then look at, of those 8 hours, how many get tracked and recorded as work. And we came in with, for 2018, pardon me, a utilization rate of 30%. The next step is what we're calling realization rate. So of those hours that you do track and record as potentially billable, how many of them end up on an invoice that a client sees? Mm-hmm. That would be, things you don't put on the invoice in the first place, or remove, things that you discount. That crucial step of what I like to call almost the sticker shock, right? Like, I can't put all this work on the invoice before the client sees it. So we came in at a realization rate of 81%. The last step is a collection rate. So of the billables that end up obviously on the invoice or bill that the client sees, how much of that is paid? And we came in at a collection rate overall of 85%.
So the big headline is that huge drop between the 8-hour workday and the 2.4 hours that the average lawyer actually manages to get paid for, or actually manages to do productive work for, and then they only get paid for 1.6 hours of it by the time they've collected the money.
Exactly.
How do we think about that missing 5.6 hours? Because the right answer can't be that you get paid for all 8 hours that you're in the office, because literally nobody works that way.
Yeah, I think that's an unreasonable expectation for one to set, but. So we kind of look at that as, our hypothesis would be one of two things. Either people don't have enough clients to drive enough of the work, or they have the clients that they need and the workload that they need, but they're doing too many non-billable things. Of course, option 3 would be a combination of both, column A and column B. And I think depending on the practice, it can be either of those things, but I see solos and small firms as being particularly vulnerable to a piece of doing all the things, right? If you think of all the hats you have to wear and all the work you have to do to run your own business, there are a lot of things that could be eating up your time that you don't eventually bill for and don't provide client value.
I remember LegalZoom doing some really interesting surveying on this, where they felt like, a solo is devoting so much of their time to management, but then at a certain level, the firm is devoting so much of its time to a different level of management, and that the optimal efficiencies seem to kick in around, I think it was somewhere between like 11 and 15 lawyers was about the size of firm where you start getting the advantages of efficiency of scale, or the efficiencies of scale, without all that bloat of trying to grow the business and having to have the middle management and everything. So, but do you have a sense of where the right balance is? Like, did you discover firms where the typical lawyer was billing 7 of 8 hours, or is it your feeling that we should probably be billing about half of our time? Like, where should that balance fall?
Yeah, I mean, because the data is anonymized, we're not really able to look at individual firms.
Sure. Yeah.
That's why we go to things like surveying and kind of see like where people report being more efficient. But we definitely saw a similar trend and have published in a previous year's report the utilization rate by firm size. So definitely saw an increase in the same way that the study from LegalZoom suggests. We also saw an interesting dip from 5 to 9 attorneys in the firm, where things would suddenly hit this rocky patch and utilization would drop, which we thought was really interesting. We spoke to a few folks in the industry and saw that tended to be this zone where when firms would start to grow, gain momentum, and get to 5 to 10, a lot of them would actually fall apart.
Yeah.
And I think that this declining utilization rate might be one of the factors. So in general, increasing the firm size leads to greater efficiencies, and I think it really does take off.
But it sounds like there's a couple of plateaus, which is borne out by, I was just reading a book by a previous podcast guest where he says, between $1 million and $10 million in revenue, somewhere in there, and I think he really lasers in on like between $1 and $3 million in revenue or something. That's where companies need to start installing multiple tiers of management, and and you usually have to. You usually stop being as profitable during that time period. And maybe that's the same kind of thing for efficiency, where you take a hit before you realize the benefit. I don't know.
Exactly. And you've got to have some staying power, right, financially to make it through that transition.
I mean, I guess the functional effect of the fact that most lawyers are, quote, missing about 2/3 of their workday is that the effective hourly rate, what your pay rate can drop down. Did you calculate what are the average effective hourly rates that lawyers are making?
Yeah, we did. So we were able to break them down by commonly used practice areas in Clio, which there are 30. So I'm not going to read them all out, but had some fun with using one example, comparing two very different practice areas. So we had a breakout for hourly work only, exclusive of flat fee work for bankruptcy law, where we saw the kind of posted rate be $335 per hour on average across the continental United States. Bankruptcy had a 74% realization rate and a 71% collection rate. So by the time we got to the bottom of that, we basically have an effective hourly rate of $176. If we compare folks who specialize in government law, one billable hour of work came in at a much lower $166 an hour as the posted price, but realization was 96% and collection was 98%. So not much attrition as you go through working with the client base, and it landed at $156 per hour. So you have two practice areas where one posts a rate that's almost more than double, but then when we get to the bottom of the funnel is almost exactly the same on an hourly basis. And I think if you were to present that to practitioners in those areas, they wouldn't think that their rates would land in almost the same place. But that's the impact that these conversion rates in the funnel can have. And yeah, they definitely impact how much you're actually effectively charging once you get to the bottom of that process.
But I mean, I'm struck by making $156 an hour is a really freaking good salary. That still ought to be good. But so many of the numbers about solo and small firms say that so many solo and small firms are struggling.
Right.
I mean, do you have some thoughts about how we maybe jive, if your average personal injury lawyer is only making $91 an hour, how do we square that with those scarier data, like the bimodal salary distribution curve that says most lawyers are taking home before taxes like $35,000 to $65,000?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things, right? One is how many of those hours, again, are going toward billable work. So if you're making $156 or $176 an hour, but only doing it for a couple of hours out of the 8-hour workday, that's a major impact.
Oh, so this is the effective hourly rates for the hours for which you're billing. So it's
exactly. Yeah.
I see. So if you divided that by 40 hours, we'd be talking more like $20 an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's how we land there. A big step toward landing there. And the other is, don't forget, the cost of running the business, right?
Mm-hmm, for sure. You know what, George? We need to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. And I've been slack on doing that because I've been engaged in this, but we'll be back in a few minutes and we'll continue talking about some of the attorney-client communication disconnect issues that you uncovered this year. So we'll be back.
Smokeball practice management software exists to streamline small law firms and reduce the stress of running a small business. With Smokeball, your firm is much more organized, productive, and profitable, meaning you and your staff can breathe easy with less stress. Visit smokeball.com/lawyerist today to learn more and book a demo. Like what you see? Lawyerist podcast listeners are eligible for 50% off onboarding. With Smokeball at your firm, it's less stress and more success. If you're not 100% happy with your law practice right now, chances are you want more. More income from your practice, more fulfillment from your work, and more freedom to enjoy your life. There's a new law business model that is allowing passionate attorneys to reclaim their lives and love practicing law again. Alexis Neely has been training lawyers for over a decade on the new law business model she created to build her own $1 million law practice. And now, the lawyers she has trained in that new law business model have their own high 6- and 7-figure law practices, all without sacrificing time with their families and only working with clients they love to serve. It is possible to experience the exhilaration of a thriving law practice, do the most meaningful legal work, have a real impact in your clients' lives, and have complete control over your schedule. Discover this new law business model now by watching the free video workshop series at newlawbusinessmodel.com/lawyerist. Did you know that attorneys who accept online payments get paid 39% faster on average than those who use traditional payment methods? With LawPay, the only payment solution offered through the ABA Advantage program, you can easily accept client payments online, via email, or in person. No equipment needed. Visit lawpay.com/lawyerist to sign up and get your first 3 months free. Trust the only payment solution developed for attorneys and recommended by 48 state bars. LawPay.
Okay, we're back. So, George, one of the things that you introduced in this 2018 report is a bunch of new survey information about the disconnect between what clients and lawyers expect out of different aspects of the relationship. Maybe you can give us the headline for that and then break down some of the most interesting things in there.
Yeah, definitely. So we wanted to deep dive into the area of how clients perceive working with law firms and how law firms are doing at meeting or exceeding client expectations. And we kind of broke it into two phases. One is when folks are looking for lawyers, like they realize they've had a legal problem and are looking to engage a law firm at the beginning of the process. And the other was once they have worked with a lawyer, how likely are they to recommend the service once they're done? The big inspiration for us there is in previous reports realizing that, despite all the advertising media and ways in which lawyers can get out there and try to attract clients, this is still overwhelmingly a referral-driven business, right? The first step that most consumers take in looking for a firm to help them with a legal problem is asking a close personal connection for a referral. So if we can do things that drive the likelihood to recommend and drive those referrals, then we're making pretty solid progress toward filling up the day, getting more clients, and of course dealing with that utilization rate issue that we discussed before the break.
Now, when you say that, my brain immediately goes, okay, asking a friend means like, I'm over to dinner at a friend's house or, I'm doing a family get together. But then I think, okay, in this day and age, it might just as easily mean posting a request for a recommendation on Facebook. Am I right to think that that's part of this or are you able to say? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely not, it doesn't have to be a face-to-face interaction. There's so many ways to collect recommendations and be pointed at the source of getting a service. And that would be one of them for sure.
Now, is that an area where you find that there's a disconnect between what clients and lawyers think about how clients are actually finding lawyers versus how lawyers think they are?
Yeah, I think most lawyers know that referrals are really important and that that's how folks would look to find them. I think what's disconnected is almost more around what clients are experiencing and how they're perceiving a lot of the things that lawyers choose to do at really crucial times of that journey.
Say more about that.
So for example, like we had this section on clients' emotions versus lawyers' perception. Overall, it's never really typically good news, right? When people are looking for legal representation and advice.
Fair.
A lot of the time it isn't, right? They're going through a moment of difficulty and they need help and kind of default to their limbic brain, right? Like they're scared, and especially if they're going through using or working with a firm for the first time, it's also unfamiliar as a process. And what we found was when we surveyed lawyers and clients and asked them the same question around when someone's looking to hire a lawyer, what are they feeling? There were some places where the responses from the firms matched up perfectly with what clients said, and some where there were like huge gaps. So some examples: anxiety, control, annoyance, and anger. Like lawyers and clients fell pretty much on par in terms of how many expected a client to feel that pain as they went through the process of hiring for a lawyer. But then some disconnects. 45% of lawyers expected their clients to be confused, while only 27% reported they were. 17% of lawyers said that they expected their clients to experience a sense of relief, whereas 51%, over half of clients, said they experienced a sense of relief in looking for and hiring a lawyer, and 8% of lawyers said they expected their clients to feel frustration, and 40% of clients said that they felt frustration.
Interesting. It makes sense, but it is an example of like, look, being client-centered in law practice means knowing what your clients are thinking, getting inside their heads. So that's helpful.
And if you think about it, right, like if you are one of those folks looking to get referrals or to fill up the day with more clients, when people are in their version of a buying mood for legal services, they've decided they need help. The tipping point is whether or not you can help them find that sense of relief versus leave frustrated and move on to another provider.
And are we saying something about the process of finding and hiring a lawyer here? Or are we saying something about the process of talking to the lawyer once you found them, or all together?
Kind of all the above. Yeah. We looked at what are the processes involved, and we also looked at what are the reasons some people avoid working with a lawyer in the first place. So there are folks who realize they have a legal issue and just kind of don't deal with it legally. And we also investigated kind of what are some of the drivers of doing that.
What did you find there? Why people avoid lawyers?
Yeah, that one was interesting. So the highest, we did like what's called a driver analysis, so a statistical study, an analysis of both how many people answered a certain question, but then how likely feeling that way would be to drive avoiding a lawyer. So the top one was, I enjoy handling legal issues myself, the DIY crowd, as I like to say. But then the next few that were all...
I enjoy it. I like that.
Yeah. So there's that. But only 22% of people responded yes to that. So a minority of respondents. We also had reasons like lawyers won't get you the outcome you want. Working with a lawyer seems overwhelming. And lawyers aren't necessary when dealing with legal problems. The one of those that jumps out the most to me is working with a lawyer seems overwhelming because it's a strong driver, but almost 40% of respondents said they believe that.
Right.
So there's this element of, this is kind of overwhelming, and it drives me away from otherwise giving a lawyer business that they could have.
That's really interesting.
It's preventable, right? Like that's the other thing is some of these things, you want to do it yourself. I can't give practitioners advice on really changing people's minds on that one, but making the process a little less overwhelming, going back to the whole thing of like setting goals and then measuring them and making progress toward them. I feel like that's a really rich area where there are a lot of simple things firms might consider doing to mitigate that.
Well, and when I think about this, it's like, so what does the process look like at this point, right? It seems overwhelming because honestly it is, right? Like, how do you find a lawyer? There are a billion choices out there. How do you know one is right for you? How do you drill down to it? Especially if none of your friends or neighbors know somebody to refer you to, or you're too embarrassed to bring it up to them. It's really freaking overwhelming. But imagine if, as part of that, you found a website of a law firm or some marketing materials that were really easy and accessible and reassuring and helped you understand that you had found the right person, you were in the right place. They weren't just trying to sell to you. They actually, reached a hand out and gave you some help along the way before you even talked to them. Like, those are some sorts of things that I think could really tamp down the overwhelmingness, I think.
Yeah, I think that, or I'd even go one simpler. In the previous report, sort of the last year's report, we surveyed firms on the response times to client inquiries.
Oh, yeah.
So how are we doing it actually even getting back to people? And one of the things that just completely jumped off the page to me is most lawyers don't respond to client inquiries at all within the first 24 hours. And it's easy to see why, right? Like, there are a lot of things that'll tie up your time. You can be in court, you can be working with other clients. In the rest of the business world, though, people are spending millions and millions of dollars on optimizing their what they call lead response time.
Yeah.
Like, when somebody comes to your website and they want to buy your stuff, you have to have a team of people ready to pounce.
Yeah.
Because the moment they walk away, they're going to go to a competitive product, or their likelihood of becoming a client drastically, actually exponentially decreases in a matter of minutes, and certainly over the course of the first hour.
Yeah.
And if we look at our response times in legal, we're measuring them in days. And when you
then
think
again,
about
if all of your competitors are equally bad, then
yeah, there you go, right? Like, no one's rattling the status quo. But if one competitor steps up and suddenly offers a responsiveness, and remember, that's not necessarily totally solving the person's problem or anything. It's literally just answering their inquiry.
Yeah.
I think that's a step that most firms can take, and there are intelligent things we can do with technology tools or outsourced services that I think are approachable if folks decide to measure and then manage how they do against that particular goal. And if we go back all the way back to, hey, I'd like to increase revenue, it's a classic example for me of something folks can say, yeah, I could try doing that and see if it increases my revenue.
Yeah, if that's the ultimate number, that's an easy one to track. See if this changes it.
Yeah.
One of the data points that I found most compelling was, or most interesting anyway, was the difference between how clients and lawyers want to receive different kinds of information.
Yes.
Say more about that.
So, yeah, definitely. So I almost considered this part of the study a little bit mean, but necessary. So what we did was we asked lawyers and clients both on how they expected to interact with each other and put them through 8 questions. Examples would be how they expect to make appointments, how they expect to sign and view documents, how they expect to make payments. So we had 8 questions in total. I'll invite people to check out the report and read all 8 of them, but I thought I would highlight a couple where we saw the biggest gaps. So the choices we presented people were you could do something in person, by phone, by email, through a website / online portal, and of course, condense other responses into an other section. There were pretty few. One of the really, really standouts for me was, how would you like to tell a lawyer all the facts or details of a situation?
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly, lawyers said, I think people should or want to do this. And remember, the question is, how do you think your clients prefer to do this? Not how would you want them to do it, but how do you think your clients prefer to do this? 51% of lawyers said by email, and 39% of lawyers said by phone. Which
is amazing to me because phone is not a majority response from consumers for any of these questions.
No. Yeah. Definitely not. But, I think what a lot of the listeners are thinking right now is it's going to be overwhelmingly online, or I don't want to talk to you. Get ready, because it's not, right? Over 70% of consumers said they wanted to explain the facts and details of their situation in person.
Yeah.
Now go back to this whole idea of relief versus frustration, and I'm going through a bit of a crisis here, whatever the legal problem might be. I need to look at the whites of someone's eyes, and I need probably human empathy around someone's got my back here. Can you help me? I need to explain myself in person. And when we compared this between millennial respondents and older generations, we actually saw exactly the same pattern. Like millennials were no
Thank
less
you. Like
likely.
that's what I wanted to see, because I know people are just going, no, probably not the millennials. Absolutely the millennials.
Yeah, they were not looking for a YouTube channel. They wanted someone to tell them it was going to be okay. And they wanted to meet with people in person.
That's awesome.
So that jumped out to me as a big one. And if you think about like, how do you make this less overwhelming or even match up a bit more with what people expect? That could be a crucial step to optimize for. I know in-person interactions can be costly and lead to interruptions, but that's a step that definitely jumped out to me.
Well, it's one of these things where, I've read some studies of, how much information is lost over the phone.
Yeah.
Because of or in text, especially like we have so much bandwidth to take in information when we're face to face with somebody, and it comes in the form of, your body language, the tone, the way your eyes are looking, which is, why you should be thinking about, do you have a laptop in front of you while you're talking to your client? But just like the communication is so much more full face to face in the same room than it could ever be over an email.
Exactly. And another thing for me is I always joke about the robot lawyer apocalypse, right? Like we read Susskind, we see the end of lawyers. We're all worried that machines are going to be giving legal advice instead of people. But, as far as we can see, folks still want to get help and work with a person as part of this process. They don't want it to be faceless, but if it is faceless or not lined up with what they want, then they leave having a frustrated experience versus the sense of relief. And we saw something similar in how people want to learn about the legal aspects of their case. So obviously, like getting something explained to them around, okay, here's the meat of the issue, the legal aspects of the case. 44% of lawyers said, again, by phone, and 44% of lawyers said by email. Over 55% of respondents on the consumer side said they wanted to do that step in person too. These were the two crucial elements of this kind of end-to-end client journey that we present, where of all of the things, people want to do these steps in person when they work with their firm. And the reason they're important is that satisfaction here doesn't only mean that their case goes well, but that they're more likely to make that referral.
Yeah.
Right? Like if someone comes on Facebook and says, what's your recommendation? If you've nailed steps like these, they're going to get you that next case and additional referral business. And that this statistically drives their likelihood to do that.
I mean, one of the things when I'm looking at this page of the report, which has a bunch of different types of interactions and how consumers and lawyers perceive it, I mean, you can just erase the lawyer side, because that if you're building a client-centered firm, that side of it doesn't even matter. But what I'm struck by is there are some clear preferences, but there are huge chunks where, talking about the facts or details of the situation. Yeah, 70% of consumers want to do it in person, but 18% are happy doing it over the phone, and 7% want to do it over an email.
Right.
So it says to me like this is a way, the recognition here isn't, okay, I'm moving it all to in-person consultations, because if you make me come to your office and I don't want to, I'm just as unhappy as if you insisted on a phone call.
Right.
So it's you can have a preference, but it feels like the takeaway should be offering alternatives, right down to a website or online portal or video chat or phone or email, or, saying, here's how I normally do it, but I'm willing to do it in any of these other ways. Just click the box or tell me how to do it or whatever. So,
yeah. And, it also segues nicely into this more advanced and almost like experimental question we asked or looked at in the report. For people who are going through a legal issue for not their first time, so they've been through at least one legal issue in the past and are doing it again, they actually showed more likelihood of considering alternatives to meeting in person, which I thought was interesting. So we asked them, like, would you be open to trying things like a virtual law firm? Or would you like to proceed without ever really meeting your lawyer in person? A few kind of, some of the more forward-thinking stuff.
Maybe when you're more comfortable with the process,
Exactly that. Like when you're more comfortable with the process, you're more likely to try alternatives as well.
That's interesting.
So it kind of tells me that, like, people have preferences. You're very right that just because there's a majority falling in one category, we shouldn't offer flexibility in how people interact, but also that clients can be educated and learn about working with a firm and change their behaviors too, which is another thing that I don't think a lot of firms think about doing, right?
Yeah.
I think many of them do, but that's another area where if you are seeing some preference among your client base that's really driving a lot of brain damage in how you practice, that's also an opportunity where you could consider alternatives, and folks who have worked with you might be open to trying different things.
So maybe we should close gradually by talking about the section in the report where you identify some quick wins, some easy ways for lawyers to really move the ball on client service.
Yeah, that's a great place for us to wind down. So a big one for me goes back to our earlier point of what gets measured gets managed. A standout thing to me was that most law firms don't systematically ask their clients for feedback in terms of how you're doing, right? Like in terms of how you're doing versus these expectations that we talked about. Honestly, an easy first step is use something like a survey, or what we chose to highlight in the report was something called Net Promoter Score. So these are easy surveys that you can send. You can do them in person or via email, and they ask one question, like how likely are you to recommend my service on a scale of 1 to 10? And they have a comment section where folks can leave you some kind of written feedback. Start there.
Yeah.
Right? That's such a easy win in terms of maybe your process isn't broken. Maybe your clients are feeling a sense of relief versus frustration, right? That's where you start, is figuring out, am I where I want to be? And do I see an opportunity to improve? I think collecting that feedback is a pretty straightforward first step.
So I have a follow-up question about that. Absolutely, I think lawyers should be asking that, and preferably asking it at least once during the representation when you still have a chance to correct it for that client.
Right.
But George, I'm curious. So we talk about Net Promoter Score a bunch. I think most lawyers should be using it, but I'm wondering if it's still, we should still think of it as effective, because I get, 5 Net Promoter Score emails a week now.
Right.
For every company that I do business with. It's become such a thing that it's just like nonstop. Everybody wants feedback all the time from me, and I'm like, screw you.
Yeah.
So do we still think
survey
it's effective?
Fatigue.
Yeah, I have survey fatigue. I have Net Promoter Score fatigue at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would fall in a category of folks who are probably getting a lot more surveys than the average person.
Maybe. Yeah.
You're probably signed up for a lot of tech tools and surveys and services that ask for feedback pretty aggressively and are early adopters of doing that kind of thing. But by and large, I don't think that most folks would be surveyed out. However, there could be other ways of doing it too. Like we give NPS as one example, but there are other things like a customer satisfaction survey, or something that's called a customer effort score, or CES in the industry. And they're all kind of the same idea. Like you just ask for a quick piece of feedback, keep it super short. Don't make it this super long questionnaire, and get a pulse, right? How are you feeling?
Yeah.
And the idea is try to kind of observe patterns over time. Like if you're trying stuff, improving the experience, trying to make it less overwhelming, spending a little bit more time in person in key steps, are people's perceptions changing or different from those who didn't do that with you? So if people are feeling survey fatigue, maybe, find a different way to ask them for feedback. But I actually think most people will be pleasantly surprised to have their firm ask them for feedback. And the other thing is don't get in a negative headspace, right?
Yeah.
Look at this feedback as information. If people aren't happy or have suggestions for improvement, as liquid gold. It's exactly your competitive advantage and informs you on what is manageable and you can fix or improve and what isn't, as opposed to kind of having a limbic brain, threat response when people give the feedback. It's hard for all of us. But in my opinion, it could turn, if you're able to do that, to hear the feedback and then iterate based on it, you're miles ahead of your competition. One
of the other quick wins that you cite is online payments, which probably doesn't deserve a lot of our time just because it's such a no-brainer. I don't know anybody I can't even find my checkbook right now, I don't think. So if you sent me a bill and you required me to pay it by check, it would be a long time before you got paid. Or I'd forget about it. So that seems like a no-brainer. What's another quick win?
Collection rate at 85% right there.
Yeah. What's another quick win that you could offer?
So I think another is trying to simplify the inquiry process through automation. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of back and forth that can be pretty transactional as part of just collecting basic information from the client. And I think there are a lot of great tools out there that can help with this inquiry and initial step, where people can feel kind of responded to or heard, or you can make it easier for you to get the info you need from folks and then get back to them and be responsive. So definitely try to automate as much of your inquiry process as you can.
What about on communications? Is there a tip that you have for lawyers changing the way they think about that going forward, apart from just printing out that page, erasing all the lawyer preferences and setting some new expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole aspect of finding how people want to consume the information and then being flexible to them is pretty key. There are going to be clients who strongly prefer having something like an online portal, log in and check the progress or updates or look at their documents that way. And for them, 100% point them in that direction. Minimizes interruptions, makes it easy, makes them feel connected, and also in control of when they'll replace that phone call or email to you where they want updates with just logging into a portal that can help them. And for folks who prefer other methods, like try to find what works for them. I mentioned kind of concentrating in-person time when it's most valuable from the client's perspective, but then also veering away from when it's not valuable as a potential efficiency that I think a lot of folks can introduce. And all of that has to do with how and where you're exchanging information with folks.
So let me see if I can tie things up here. So I think if you're listening and if you are already setting goals and you are sympathetic to the way that we talk about things at Lawyerist, then obviously you probably already have the legal trends report and you understand why it's interesting. If you don't fall into that category, and that means you're probably one of these lawyers who have said that you define your success around firm revenue, but you're not necessarily happy with how that's going. This kind of data is where those answers are for you. And there's more in the report. We've really just scratched the surface, but we've tried to pull out some of the most interesting things. It's worth getting. Like I said, the link is in the show notes, is at clio.com/LTR. I think digging through there is probably some of the answers for why your firm revenue isn't increasing in the way that you hope. And using that data can help move you forward. The other resource I'd give to you is use the small firm scorecard on our site. It's also free. It will also help you measure where you need to go to be successful. And I think it will help out. George, thanks so much for being with us today and talking about the Legal Trends Report. Thank you for doing it and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Sam. Pleasure to be here.
Make sure to catch next week's episode of the Lawyerist podcast by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast app. And please leave a rating to help other people find our show. You can find the notes for today's episode on lawyerist.com/podcast.
The Lawyerist podcast is produced with help from Lindsay Calhoun and edited by Paul Fisher. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not endorsed by Legal Talk Network. Nothing said in this podcast is legal advice for you.